Welcome back to our final presentations for the day. The panel is titled Who's Alternative? Interrogating Methods of Display, History, and Visibility. We're excited today to have our moderator, Pratibha Parmar, who's a writer, director, and producer of fiction, nonfiction, and experimental film. She's an award-winning filmmaker whose work has received international recognition. She's currently a visiting artist and Viola Frey Distinguished Visiting Professor here at CCA. Professor Parmar brings her vast experience of storytelling and extensive knowledge from her long professional career to the teaching environment, inspiring students to discover their unique artistic voices. Her most recent feature documentary film, Alice Walker, Beauty and Truth, tells the compelling life story of American literary icon Alice Walker, who made history as the first African-American woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Color Purple. The film was broadcast nationwide in the US on the Emmy Award-winning series American Masters on PBS in February 2014, kicking off Black History Month. Please help me welcome Professor Parmar.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Terza for inviting me to be one of the moderators here today. I'm really enjoying my time here at CCA as a visiting professor. So I'm going to follow the same format as we've had throughout the day and introduce the panelists, and they'll come up one by one and do their presentations. Rachel Endoso is a practicing conceptual poet and interdisciplinary writer whose interests in cross-cultural mapping and memory, identity, and forms of narration have guided her projects. Born in Maryland to Austro-Hungarian, Chinese, and Filipino parents and raised in California, she now lives in Northern California. She's been a contributing writer to Art Practical and an active member at the Asian American Women Artists Association. She holds a BA minor in psychology and studio art from Seattle University, working prior to working at the intersection of community mental health and the judicial system. Her current thesis explores multiracial identity in America and art criticism's possibilities for collective transformation and political intervention. Melissa Miller is an artist and writer living and working in the San Francisco Bay Area. Melissa is currently pursuing her MFA in studio art and MA in visual and critical studies at California College of the Arts. Melissa received her BFA in printmaking with a minor in art history from the University of Oregon's Robert D. Clark Honors College in 2011. Melissa's MA thesis, The Possible at BAM PFA, continues the critique of art institutions explored in her visual work. Her art and curatorial projects have been featured in Hyperallergic, the SF Chronicle, SFAQ, and Art Enthusiast. Her writing has been published in Art Practical, Daily Serving, and Carrots and Sticks. Finally, Natalie Catasús is a Miami-born poet, translator, and essayist. She holds an MFA in writing from CCA and a BA in literature and Spanish from New College of Florida. Much of her work focuses on narratives of displacement and possibilities opened up by hybrid approaches to nonfiction. She has served as an editor for 1111, Journal of Literature and Art, as well as for Voice of Witness, a nonprofit book series and oral history education program. Her writing has been published in Art Practical, Jai Alive magazine, and she has poetry forthcoming in Denver Quarterly. Please help me in welcoming first Rachel.
It started with the desire to put my finger on Americanness. I was looking at the work of photographer Robert Frank and realized my American perspective, because of how we have racialized identities, was inconceivable. So now it has become a journey. And as a gesture and a position today, I wish to speak from 4 racialized identities at once. Filipina, Pinay Longing Balakbayan, Asian American, multiracial American, and American, and I would like to take you along this road. The Americans, a book of portraits taken between 1955 and 56 on Frank's first road tour of the United States, produced an iconic display of Americans as racialized black and white citizens, in which I or other bodies of color did not exist despite our presence. When I did, however, find a glimmer of my history in the book, it was at Chinese Cemetery, San Francisco, the only photograph of Asian America in the book. In this image, I see a hillside with Daly City fog hovering, stirring in me a collective memory of histories, of people degraded to a yellow peril, the American anxiety of Asia encroaching, and the Asian body inhabiting the American landscape. This fog is a metaphor. I see looming fog, like the fear of communism spreading to America's shore from Korea, Vietnam, and China after World War II. I see fog returning like the ongoing competition and relation between the US and Asia. It is inscrutable fog, for as soon as I start to perceive a direction in it, it disappears. Like the continual erasure of Asian American and other bodies of color from aesthetic Americanness. I look to the bottom of the image for refuge, only to find that the flowers on the grave are tipped over. I think about the history of Asian America unattended to. I think about ghostliness. I see in the dirt of the abandoned flowers the bodies of early Chinese immigrants who were beaten, harassed, and lynched at mines and railroads. The petals blowing across the grave barrier like their unheard whispers. Looking at this photograph was a psychic and corporeal heartbreak, a materially real mark of American racialization. It was historical grief, a fog that appears and passes as I move onward with more questions. I turn to My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, a film by the Japanese-American activist and filmmaker Renee Tajima Peña. Filmed during the 1990s culture wars, she set out to represent her version of the American road trip, resulting in an 87-minute road memoir and documentary of America from an Asian American perspective. In the poster photograph for the film, we see a young Renee, taken by her family on their first road trip out of Chicago. We see her standing at a viewpoint wearing a plain white t-shirt and holding a white bread sandwich, reflecting American coding of the Asian American at home in the United States. Yet while this family memento delivers a portrait of being at home in America, it also stages the uncanny, as we notice that the poster image is a mirror image of the original, and that in both, the Statue of Liberty turns its back on her. For the Asian American viewer, this cues an unhomely moment, a collapse of the social and psychic, the remembering ourselves as forgotten and misread. For viewers who see these images and mistake Renee as belonging elsewhere, it may also be an unhomely moment of realizing America has belonged to its others. In this mirroring, the film is staged, when viewers begin to see the Asian American social paradox as both at home and estranged, their racialized identity without a given place in the American social. So, in one sense, My America, Tajima Peña's road trip, is about telling her own story in order to build a group history, to then show a more contemporary portrait. As she drives across the state, she locates a variety of intersectional identities: the Korean-American rappers Golden MC and Psycho Mike MC, Chinese-American debutantes, and Japanese-American activist and civil rights icon Yuri Kochiyama. In these portraits, Tajima Peña locates Asian American identity at intersections of race, class, and gender within a variety of ethnic and cultural orientations, but most of all, she prompts viewers to more questions than answers. In Seattle, Washington, we encounter the Korean-American brothers and rappers known as Golden MC and Psycho Mike MC. We see them after their performance with chopsticks eating with friends at an Asian restaurant, and we perhaps notice a difference in their Asianness, as their half-clipped overalls echo a popular TV show at the time. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the story of a young teenager played by Will Smith, whose Philadelphia upbringing clashes when he moves to his relative's neighborhood of Bel-Air. I wonder if these brothers have put their own spin on this to express their experience of social tension, finding a relational affinity through Black American pop culture. In the next scene, we see them at home. Michael Park tells the camera about an incidence of verbal racism from a white subject while at a burger joint. We notice his t-shirt printed with a famous photograph of Malcolm X armed at his home and his self-defense phrase, "by any means necessary." I wonder if these brothers will be welcomed or understood as belonging in these social spheres, knowing that the boundaries of race are often played out in cultural exchange between peers. For example, is the brother on the right with a Korean flag t-shirt more legible? In a completely different space, we find ourselves in Anaheim, California at a hybrid Chinese-American debutante ball, where the debutante curtsy is fused with a bow of the head. The daughter curtsy bows to her father instead of towards the audience. These cues of initiation in a hybrid manner mark the young woman's entry into social society and a move away from first-generation traditions into American culture. As we observe these portraits, we realize Asian American is anything but monolithic and more heterogeneous, open to complexities of class and gender in between Asian and American customs, and often a new blend. But seeing that Asian American is characterized well by diversity of differences between ethnic groups and individual expression, I wonder in what collective way can it benefit culture at large, in spite of the category's essentialism. The portrait of Yuri Kochiyama, an iconic Japanese-American civil rights activist, gives us a glimpse of its application in a shared political landscape. We see Yuri and her husband Bill in Mississippi, visiting the home of the Davises, the family that housed their son Billy and other freedom riders, civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated South. In this visit, we might remember Yuri's engagement with the Organization of Afro-American Unity and her early activism as a parent in Harlem. And we might also connect her experience of forced internment as a Japanese-American citizen during World War II as a collective story within Asian American and American histories. My America's engagement with Asian American history and American racialization was a revelation to me. At homes where things like our clock were in Chinese characters, only once in a while would we see my Filipina and Chinese families. And we never directly discussed race in America, although I could see the positive, negative, and creative effects of forced migration and assimilation over generations. But in the case of the Philippine Islands, the mark was different, more to do with its status as an American colony since the 19th century. So when I came upon Tajima Peña's portrait of Filipina Irish sisters in Louisiana, it got me thinking.
Benita! I'm coming.
I pay a visit with the matriarchs of Louisiana's oldest Filipino clan. This is Benita and Audrey and May and Joyce, and it's poker night in St. Bernard Parish.
Yes, just hold this for a few minutes. Okay. 3 aces. That's it, 3 aces.
Do you consider yourself Southerners first or Filipinos first?
Oh, we're Southerners first. We're Americans first, Southerners second. We're Southerners. We're definitely Southerners.
Filipinos first.
Yeah. I don't say that. Now my grandmother's sister used to say, "That's my flag," my grandmother's. That is not your country, the Philippines. This is your country. What big wrong was this?
The Philippines is not your country? I suppose after 200 and some odd years in America, you do start to feel at home.
You caught my 5.
When I show this clip, people laugh, seeing Asians or Filipinos with Southern accents. Though yes, this is a surprise, it strikes no chords of humor in me. It is compelling how Benita states her lack of identification with anything Filipino, saying we're Southerners first, Americans second, and ignores from the other side of the table Filipinos third. And also compelling is how Tajima Peña speaks back to them in voiceover, questioning their perception of themselves. This strikes me as a critical dialogue to the complications of identity. For example, are these sisters passing in white society? They certainly are half Irish and shouldn't be denied that. But the loss of their Filipino identity becomes more complex in the following scene, where they recall their birth certificates said white, and their original ancestors were considered citizens of Spain. Understanding the forces shaping these sisters means conceptualizing hybridity, the condition of assimilation and practices marked by survival within unequal power and domination. I think about the 5 centuries of colonization in the archipelago, first by the Spanish and forms of indentured servitude, some escaped, and its American colonization afterwards, wondering how we begin to trace these cultures and its changes over time, all the way up to the complexity of a Filipino-American identity with neocolonial tensions. As a gesture and a position today, I hoped to speak from 4 racialized identities at once, to make a point about static oppositions in favor of becoming legible. There are many wounds from how race has mattered, but also new conceptions of Americanness. I am finding that race is often relational in production, and violence a recurrence of socio-historical misunderstanding or disinterest. For me, these things are not just about identity politics, but a needed reformation of social subjecthood, where each of us gives greater creativity to a new politics of the political. Thank you.
So my thesis examines a 2014 exhibition at the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, or BAMPA, called The Possible. I've been thinking about the possible since last spring when I took a class here at CCA called Making the Museum. As part of this course, my classmates and I spent a few hours a week at BAMPA, participating in the exhibition and meeting to discuss related readings. We gained access to the possible through one of our instructors, whose collective, called The Something, had been invited to participate in the show. During the possible, BAMPA transformed a series of their galleries into active artist studios. In addition to The Something's audiovisual and performative installation pictured here, the studios also included a textile studio, a publication studio or print shop, a ceramic studio, and a multi-sensory library with both print and sound archives. The exhibition was even extended to the garden surrounding the museum with the inclusion of a physical activity studio and outdoor showers. Lastly, a gallery was dedicated to a custom pedestal designed to showcase works being produced in the galleries. Guest curator and Oakland-based artist David Wilson invited over 100 artists to participate in the possible. These artists were encouraged to lead workshops, to work in new and familiar mediums, and to collaboratively produce and learn. A series of Sunday workshops, as well as lectures, events, and field trips, were also scheduled over the course of the 4-month exhibition and were open to the general public. This structure of the possible is reflective of Wilson's ribbons practice, in which he develops gatherings from his repeated visits to rural or natural sites in Northern California. After in-depth exploration of the landscape through watercolor and drawn studies, Wilson organizes an event at the location, inviting guests with hand-drawn maps and printed materials. According to his website, Ribbons gatherings draw together a wide net of artists, performers, filmmakers, chefs, and artisans into situation-based collaborative relationships. This interdisciplinary grouping of makers and crafters, combined with the off-the-grid settings for the events, provides Ribbons gatherings with a utopian and collective feel, nostalgically recalling California's commune movement of the 1960s. But what happens to an art practice like Wilson's when it moves into an institution like BAMFA, which is supported by the University of California system and is one of the nation's largest university art museums? As Wilson's longest-running project to date, The Possible is emblematic of a trend in museum programming that reimagines the art museum as participatory, experiential, and democratic. New exhibition models break from our traditional expectations about museums. When we think about a museum, we might imagine a sign that says, "Please look, but don't touch." The turn away from these models towards participatory programming has mostly been interpreted as an extension of the museum's educational responsibility and as an opening of the institution to a wider public. Sometimes these changes even seem to be in response to critiques leveled against the museum in the past. Both artists and cultural historians have critiqued the traditional museum model for being complicit in the production of capitalist subjectivity. Art historian and curator Dorothea von Hanselmann argues that the traditional exhibition model embodies a set of values tied to Western market societies, including the production and circulation of objects, a linear notion of time that emphasizes progress, and the prioritization of the individual. In museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which still very much utilizes traditional exhibition models, it is easy to locate these values. Objects produced by an established set of masters are used to illustrate art historical narratives of progress. Because it focused on process, experience, and collaboration, it is easy to assume that the possible broke from the set of values associated with older exhibition models. But in order to understand how these values may have actually manifested in the possible, it is important to understand how changes in consumer culture have enabled shifts in artistic production more broadly. We now live in what von Hanselmann calls the experience society, in which experience has replaced objects as the most valuable commodity. Today, successful businesses not only create desired products, they also create experiences or lifestyles around their products, or simply sell us experience itself. Over the past 50 years, contemporary art practices have also come to reflect this change in how we conceptualize products. Artists are no longer expected to simply produce objects. They also perform, lead public programs, or facilitate participatory projects. These changes have often been conceptualized as anti-capitalist or anti-market, but the work of art is inextricably tied to the commodity form. As we have seen in broader consumer society, experience is now marketable and sellable. Changing notions of artistic production should also be interpreted more dialectically along similar terms. The Possible's inclusion of a gallery dedicated to finished works in a show about process demonstrates the complicated status the object continues to play in the art world. Every Wednesday, Wilson and a team of preparators would select objects from the studios to display on the pedestal. Although the work was not labeled chronologically, for participants or repeated visitors, the pedestal became the place to visualize the progress of the exhibition. This photograph shows a collection of masks and banners that were created for the Possible's opening ceremony and later displayed on the pedestal. The growing collection of artifacts displayed in Gallery 3 reiterated the extent to which production and process, as well as experience-based activities like the opening ceremony, became the actual objects of the exhibition. In this sense, the Possible embodied capitalism's attention to the object in two ways: literally through the production and circulation of objects, and more abstractly by turning production and process into an object for consumption itself. If you were to walk up to the pedestal, you probably wouldn't know the artists who made each piece unless you had seen them make it. In a few cases, you may recognize an artist's particular style, but otherwise, no information about the artist or the work was provided as would be typical in a museum's wall text or educational materials. This system of display seems to counter the Metropolitan Museum of Art model and could be seen as a totally democratic system with no hierarchy being established between the objects by reputable artists and the work produced by visiting children. However, the lack of refinement in this set of objects does more than signal the experimental and process-focused studios of the possible. The handicraft aesthetic that dominates the objects on the pedestal also visualizes how museums parallel advertising companies when they ask visitors to call forward their inner child. The experienced society demands that consuming individuals behave like children, that we give in to our sense of wonder and play and allow awe and excitement to propel our desires. Furthermore, the collection of works displayed on the pedestal also brings up a set of questions around the idea of authorship and, by extension, labor that complicate the possible seemingly engaging and collaborative structure. Because no identifying information was provided, everything created during the possible was ultimately presented to the public as authored by David Wilson. Despite the possible's collaborative rhetoric established through its name and structure, the possible was not a group show. Instead, the possible should be viewed as an extended ribbons gathering, in which case David Wilson is both the curator and the artist on display. In this sense, despite allegedly setting up a collective environment, the possible was actually all about one individual. At one point, this reality became clear to my classmates and me. As a group, we decided with the Somethings Collective to consolidate and cover every piece of AV equipment in the Somethings Gallery. Because we thought the possible wasn't living up to the experimental and collective mission that had been advertised, we wanted to make an intervention into the show. We specifically covered the equipment and materials with a series of white tarps we fastened together to aesthetically recall a 1979 work by artist Maria Nordman at BAMFA, then called the University Art Museum. During one day only, dawn to dusk, Nordman had all the art removed from the galleries and installed a seamless floor of white vinyl across the museum's concrete. Nordman's work asked visitors to experience the museum in a completely different way than they were used to, not unlike the goals set forward for the possible. In addition to aesthetically reflecting art historical precedents of BAMFA, we saw the covering of the AV equipment as a critical act, as interrupting the audience's ability to engage with something that was constructed to be participatory and experiential. We also liked the visual relationship our mound had to the pedestal collecting objects in the gallery below. But what we thought was a conceptual, well-researched, and intentional gesture was met with this sign. The something is in the midst of a space transition. Enjoy this slumber installation and expect new action soon. Thank you. I tell you this story to further demonstrate how a single individual's vision was prioritized over the producing collectives. This anecdote also illustrates how once Wilson's ribbon practice was moved indoors inside the Berkeley Art Museum, Wilson himself became institutionalized. His role shifted from that of the artist facilitator to that of the curator and public relations representative. The possible attempted to implement an anything goes model of the museum, but it became clear that in the museum, artistic action still needs to maintain legibility under an established set of criteria. Despite its collaborative rhetoric and nod to the 1960s, the possible actually prioritized authorial genius over collective production and embodied a set of capitalist values associated with traditional museum exhibitions. It is not enough to simply present a set of politics. We must struggle to find ways to embody and enact them. Thank you.
In the decades since the 1959 Cuban Revolution, tens of thousands of Cuban rafters, also known as balseros, have taken to the Straits of Florida by raft or small boat, embarking on a dangerous journey away from the island nation. This talk will explore how U.S. representations of the balsero crossings shape public perception of the issue within the U.S. A photo taken by a Miami Herald staff photographer depicts a desperate scene. A group of balseros travel aboard a raft covered in a blue tarp. The edge of their oblique vessel dips precariously low into the choppy blue water. Some of the balseros sit, while those who stand clutch their paddles for balance as they look out in all directions. Who can tell which way is forward here? The sea that surrounds them hopelessly extends beyond the frame of the photograph so that viewers, perhaps like the pictured balseros, lack a point of reference with which to judge whether they're headed in the right direction. There's no horizon in sight. The Straits of Florida form a natural border between Cuba and the United States, its waters narrowing to roughly 90 miles where the journey across is shortest. But despite the body of water's function as a national border, with no wall or fence or human-made markers of territory, this spatially massive border seems invisible. The balseros enter this blue expanse, this gap between national borders, in hopes of reaching U.S. soil. It is estimated that as many as 100,000 Cubans may have died in the Straits of Florida, though the exact number remains unknown. The balseros who die in the Straits die in international waters, and there is no official procedure for reclaiming and identifying them. Even if there were, the sea and its powerful current engulf the bodies, leaving few visible traces behind. In the absence of visual representations of the dead, the circumstance of the balsero at sea is revealed in representations of the living. A closer look at the Miami Herald photo will show that 4 of the balseros seem to be facing in the direction of the viewer. One man stands on the sinking edge of the vessel, waving a sun-worn American flag. The exceptional nature of this moment emerges with this flag. It's doubtful that this man has been holding this position the whole time they've been out on the water. The man hails in the direction of the camera, his billowing flag a symbol of their resolve to land on U.S. soil. The fact that the balseros acknowledge the camera raises the question of the position of the photographer. What seems at first to be an insignificant obstruction of the photo lens in the upper right-hand corner betrays the photographer's position on a neighboring vessel. This photo, taken by a photojournalist during the 1994 Cuban rafter crisis, would have been shot during a ride-along on a U.S. Coast Guard ship on a mission to rescue balseros adrift at sea. Photojournalists have created an important body of work documenting the plight of the balseros over the years. As a result, U.S. news media has defined and proliferated a balsero image type that has become both iconic and conventional. However, in the majority of these representations, only the living are made visible. These images are taken from U.S. Coast Guard ships or from the Brothers to the Rescue planes that would fly over the straits trying to spot drifting balseros. The fact of the photographer's position on one of these designated rescue vessels means that in the case of the most iconic photographs of balseros at sea, image equals rescue. The photographer literally shares the position of the rescuing agent, and the photograph extends this perspective to viewers. Ironically, the media image that conveys the desperation of the balseros at the same time reassures the U.S. viewer that the event is near resolution. The image takes place only when rescue is imminent. This visual rhetoric uplifts the narrative of the rescued refugee and conflates U.S. positionality with humanitarian intervention. Such rhetoric elides the fact that since the 1994 Cuban rafter crisis, when wet foot, dry foot, when this policy was implemented, Cuban rafters are required to set foot on U.S. soil in order to be granted a path to residency. Those who are intercepted at sea by the U.S. Coast Guard are sent to temporary detention camps or repatriated to Cuba. These images halt the narrative of rescue in the moment that conveys U.S. humanitarian aid. Image doesn't simply mean rescue, it also means capture. Out at sea, the balsero is rhetorically caught in an impossible position between two countries engaged in a continuous ideological battle. To Cuba, they are dissenters and traitors. To the US, they are border crossers and undesirables. But for the balsero who does not get rescued, who disappears into the watery depths of the straits, the absence of representation betrays the political stakes of recognizing these deaths. The image of the rescued refugee makes it possible to fold the balsero into a narrative that absolves the United States of responsibility for the deaths of non-citizens that happen just beyond its borders. Meanwhile, the seascape obscures the evidence of these deaths below its surface. The lost balsero, then, is both visually and politically relegated to the realm of the unrepresentable. In the absence of representation, what is left of the lost balseros? Echoing the balseros who have disappeared into the water, the empty rafts continue their journeys. The Straits of Florida uniquely act as a border that immediately subsumes the bodies of those who cross it, but pushes their belongings to our shores. Countering the accumulation of media images that negate the dead, the empty rafts continuously wash up onto Florida beaches. They evoke a sense of absence that is inextricably bound to the mysterious fates of their passengers. They emerge worn and rusted, masses of swollen, cracked wood and tattered canvas. These ephemeral objects, perhaps created only to last the few days' journey anticipated by their makers, continue to deteriorate on land. Out of the thousands of rafts that have arrived, a few have made their way into local museums. The History Miami Museum in downtown Miami showcases a single raft called the TOB. The TOB has a distinct bow and stern as well as a sail, although its canvas siding and plywood frame betray its handmade origins. It is part of a sparsely curated exhibition called History and Ourselves that, according to the museum, features the top artifacts and archives from the museum's collections over the years that relate to the themes arrive, adapt, grow, and live. The objects themselves are not interrelated outside of having some connection to the city of Miami. The Cuban raft appears alongside basketball court floor panels featuring the Miami Heat logo and a sign for the fictional Miramar Playa Hotel, which was the setting for a television show set in Miami called Magic City that ran for 2 seasons before getting canceled. How does the museum's positioning of the raft alongside a set piece from a fictional television show impact a viewer's reception of its historical and political significance? Is the raft just another feature of Miami's colorful local history? For many residents of Miami, whose regional history has been so heavily impacted by the legacy of the Cuban rafters, the raft is likely legible as a trace of the balsero crossings. However, the complete removal of the vessel from the international context of Cuban migration to the U.S. both dehistoricizes and depoliticizes the object. This is most evident in the museum's descriptive plaque for the TOB, which reads as follows. Cuban Raft, 1994. This raft carried 7 people, all rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard and taken to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The raft later washed up on Soldier Key, gift of world resources. No mention that 1994 was the year of the Cuban rafter crisis, when more than 32,000 Cubans attempted to cross the Straits of Florida. No mention of how many people have died during this journey. A crucial detail that this plaque evades is that during the rafter crisis, the balseros were not simply taken to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, but were transferred to the U.S.-operated Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, where the refugees lived for months in an overcrowded and unsanitary detention camp surrounded by barbed wire. Like the images of the balseros rescued at sea, the museum display of this Cuban raft halts the narrative in the moment of rescue. Identified only by the national and cultural designation Cuban and the year it was found, the TOB is presented as if it were some foreign or ancient artifact whose origins are unknown. In this context, the raft sheds its history. Presenting the lone raft as a mysterious artifact not only erases the spatial and political context from which it emerged, but positions the raft and the Balseros crossings as anomalous events of a historical past. To position the raft as an anomaly is to suggest that the Balsero crossings are somehow unusual or exceptional. In reality, the rafts are the traces of what has become a regular occurrence in the Straits of Florida. But because each raft is removed from the shore upon arrival, the visual traces of the Balsero crossings are systematically swept out of the landscape and out of public view. When the raft becomes a foreign artifact, when it becomes an anomaly, so does the Balsero. Together, the museum and the media construct a visual representation of the Balsero crossings that implies false resolution. While the image proliferates a narrative of rescue, the exhibition reinforces that narrative by sealing it into a vague historical past. By severing them from their contexts, these representations effectively depoliticize the remaining traces of the Balsero crossings. Even following the announcement that Cuba and the US will move toward restoring diplomatic relations, more and more Balseros set out to the Straits of Florida today. Just as representations of the Balsero crossings do not mark their end, neither does the recent announcement signify a smooth or immediate transition into normal relations. If we are to move forward, we must resist moving on. Perhaps it is easy to forget and move on when the sea obscures the evidence of death and when the deaths occur beyond our border and seem only to affect non-citizens. But the immense human loss that occurs at our doorstep does not pertain exclusively to one country. Rather, it is a loss shared by the two. And with that shared loss comes shared responsibility. By attending to the ways that our perception is constructed through representations and omissions within our own visual culture, we can begin to rethink our relationships to entities that have only been made to seem so very far away. Thank you.
I think that was a really terrific, very compelling, all three of your presentations were really compelling and a great way to finish the day off. So thank you, all three of you. Another round of applause for them. One of the things that I sort of, when watching you give your presentations and engaging with it, there's a strong thread that I felt that runs through all three of your work. And one of the sort of things that really struck me was the vigorous critiquing that you are all engaged in, and kind of contesting modes of representation and methodologies of displays and exhibition. And, you know, this is what I think is so utterly necessary to create this kind of a complex discourse and in order to have, you know, question visual cultures and how does visual culture actually create change. So, you know, I applaud you all for that. Rachel, I really was curious to see if when in your research, when you were looking at, say, for instance, the work of Renee Tajima Pena, were there any other artists whose work you discovered that who embody intersectional identities, histories, and who are actually challenging the American narrative in their work, enshrining what is America, a cartography of that American history, is, you know, that you question that because you question that canon, and you say, you talk about your longing, and that longing is to kind of right the erasure, to somehow rectify the erasure of your multifaceted identities and histories. So, you know, I think that that's a kind of a really interesting impulse that you come from, and the critique that you make of Frank's work is, it's something for us to all remember, is that's a necessary critique, because that is what enshrines or becomes, defines national culture, national communities, national identities. Yeah.
Fascinated by Natalie's presentation. All three of them excellent. I was going to ask you, are you familiar with the artist, the Cuban artist named Endoso?
Yes, I am, and all of his raft work. For those of you who aren't familiar, Gacho is a Cuban artist living and working on the island. And during the 90s, when there was a huge influx of balseros crossing, he was producing a lot of sculpture and installation work that used the raft as an icon. I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's something that has come up a lot throughout this work, and is definitely something to address in the future iteration that will be a little bit less US centric.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
How for each one of you has preparing for your presentation changed your life in both expected and unexpected ways?
Great question.
I guess I'm up. Thank you for the question. The possible was proved to be really challenging for me, just because there was so much going on and I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to tackle this project, but just something felt off. So it's taken a lot of work to figure out what my actual stance is, and it still sort of goes in flux sometimes. There's a lot more to be said and to do in terms of it. I think what's been really interesting this year is just thinking about how this project has impacted my other writing projects, whether it be reviewing other artworks and really seeing that I've developed a sort of interest in specifically like a Californian identity and how that plays out in our art world here. So.
I feel like preparing for this symposium was very difficult for me in a really great way, where I'm often more comfortable writing and not necessarily having ever to speak that writing. So unexpectedly, I'm more calm than I thought today, which is crazy. And I'm really realizing how amazing this kind of presentation of people's thoughts is. I have a lot of respect for it. I already did, but I mean, what a way to hear people kind of regurgitate all of the stuff that they've been, it's like incubating and percolating and all of those words. So, yeah, it's done me good to my own surprise.
I'll just respond really quickly to that. To echo some of what you guys were saying, I definitely agree. And I think the challenge of presenting work that is really just a snapshot of the work that we've begun here and are going to continue to do, and to at the same time contend with the fact that the world goes on while you produce this type of work. When I started this project, I didn't know that they were going to restore diplomatic ties between the two countries. So how do you, adapt to those types of changes? It's been valuable.
Mm-hmm. One last question? Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I feel like it's a two-part question. I'll start by saying in the thesis I talk about the fact that the Berkeley Art Museum is moving buildings, and how this was really like their last hurrah before they closed down the Bancroft building. And I think of it, and in fact Larry Rinder has been interviewed and has said that the possible sort of is like almost like a test for what the new museum will be like. So I staged my whole thesis on this model going forward. And I also talk about the possible as an experiment, like failure is inherent to an experiment. You do it with the understanding that you won't always get a perfect result. So that's to answer like the first part of the question. The second part is that I was there as part of a class, and part of that class was really focused on institutional critique. So admittedly, our class was probably pretty antagonistic. We were reading a lot of institutional critique theory, and we just were asked to go into it with sort of like a questioning before we even got there. So it also became probably a little bit more antagonistic when we realized that we were relegated to the realm of students and not artists. So there's a lot of layers to my participation in the show. And I'll also say that our professor tended to have more direct contact with David Wilson. But I interviewed David Wilson. He knows I've worked on this project, so we've talked about some of these things too. Yeah, but not specifically the note on the wall.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, and don't leave because there's more to come apparently. So thank you.